I'm so glad that you're here with us in worship as we continue this journey through Romans. Thanks for being a part of it. This week we look at the same scriptures that we looked at last week. By the way, I've heard you, and I promise we'll start moving faster. We've spent a lot of time in these first 17 verses, and we do get to pick up the pace from here a little bit. But last week we looked at this sort of thesis statement, and we talked about how Paul will continue to come back to these notes and sort of reimagine them as we go through this symphony that he is writing, explaining his gospel. I want to introduce another metaphor this week that I find to be helpful, also from N.T. Wright, about a map, like a paper one, not a phone, that you unfold. He talks about Romans and sort of a roadmap through it being like something that as you unfold the map, you at first see one little piece of it, and then you're gonna be able to locate that on the wider picture as you go through. This piece is a critical part of understanding what it is that we're going to head into. And so I want to make sure that we have a good roadmap to move forward from. And so I want you to hear these words one more time. This is verse 16 and 17 of chapter 1. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faithfulness for faithfulness. As it is written, the righteous one will live by my faithfulness. So Paul, in speaking to a variety of audiences, will often craft his language, being the master author that he is, to hit different people in different places. And last week we talked about a couple of audiences that Paul was speaking to and histories that Paul was drawing from. And I want to talk about a third one this morning in a way that we might understand what he means when he says, I am not ashamed, that opening phrase of that thesis statement, and where he gets from that. Today, as we look at the third one, I want us to spend some time in the Old Testament. Remember, we've said that Paul draws from his Jewish history and his Jewish scriptures over and over again. We're going to spend some time there because he spends a lot of time and energy shaping ideas from there. And it will help us as we sort of begin to unfold this map to understand what he's talking about. And so if you have a Bible, I want to invite you to turn to Habakkuk, one of my favorite actual books. I mean that seriously, even if I pronounce it three different ways. One of my favorite books in the Bible. And we're going to read from that a few different pieces. And actually, Paul has already quoted from that at the very end of our reading. So turn there if you have a Bible. But as you do that, I want to ask you a question. I wonder if you've ever found yourself just on the brink in some relationship with another person. Like it was about to fall apart. You were over it. Things were done. You were frustrated. You were up to your eyeballs. You were angry at them. And maybe to make it worse, the other person didn't even really know that there was a problem. Have you ever been in that situation where you get yourself really worked up, and the fact that they don't know it's a problem makes the problem even worse? I've been in that place before where you just sort of get frustrated and you think, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. I'm out. I'm going to finish this. But then they surprised you. They said the exact right thing at the exact right moment. You got a call after it had been radio silent. Something came out of the blue. Perhaps it's with a friend or a significant other. They've grown distant or they've been ghosting you, and you think, you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore. But then the phone rings. And then they say something, and you remember why that relationship is important, and perhaps it invites you to step back from the ledge. Maybe it's in a workplace. Maybe it's a subordinate, somebody that you're fed up with. But then all of a sudden they have some idea, some project, some proposal. All of a sudden they haven't been producing for weeks. It hasn't been working for months. But then they do something and you're like, okay, we're still going to have to work on that thing. But maybe they can stick around a little bit longer. Or let's make it less personal. Maybe there's a band that you used to absolutely love and you followed them religiously, or some film producer that you really like what they do, or perhaps an author whose books or poetry you're really drawn to, and that was formative in your experience of life, but then you came to a place where whatever they were producing just wasn't doing it anymore. The music wasn't enjoyable, the books weren't easy. The movies weren't good. And you said, you know what, I think I'm done with this. And all of a sudden, they put something out. And you remembered why you fell in love with them in the first place. Some piece of art. And you're like, oh, that is brilliant. Have you ever been in that place in your relationship with God? Where you get to the point and you're like, I am so fed up with this. I'm so angry. God, what are you doing? What is going on? Have you checked out? Do you not see what's happening? I'm completely overwhelmed. Life seems too much. Things are coming at me from all angles. Where are you? What is going on? Maybe it's that angry fist in the air, yelling into the night sky. Have you been in that place? Habakkuk is there. I told you this is one of my favorite books because it's so real and honest. And it has some resolution at the end of it. It's short. I think it's 4 chapters. But it's not a resolution that tries to put a pretty bow on really difficult questions. It allows some dissonance to remain. I like it because Habakkuk is honest, like brutally honest. Fist shaking in the air at God kind of honesty. I think that it's really powerful and it's real. And it's important to remember that Habakkuk is speaking in sort of dual languages as well. He's speaking about his own experience, but he's also a prophet. He's an Old Testament prophet. And so he's also speaking on behalf of the people of Israel who are struggling, who are angry, who have oppression pressing in from all sides. And so there's this sort of dual thing where he's speaking like, hey, what's going on? But also like all of us are like, hey, where are you, God? Don't we have some sort of agreement? This is what the book opens with. This is verse 1, chapter 2. Just listen to this honesty. Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you won't listen? How long do I have to cry to you violence, but you will not save? Why do you make me see wrongdoing and look at trouble? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. That's pretty honest. He's making note of the problem of evil that's around him. But this is what I find so interesting. What's the problem? The enemy that will oppress him. The army that will crush and destroy him and the people of Israel. The fact that there's not enough food on the table and there's not enough crops in the field. The fact that others are stealing from them. There's all of these problems, but where does he direct his complaint? Not there or there or there. He directs it to God. We do that. When our friends abandon us, when we lose somebody that we love, when we get news that we weren't ready for, when it all presses in, where are you, God? We have this complaint, and we do sort of the same thing that Habakkuk does. It's like we say, God, I thought we had a deal. I thought that I was being faithful and doing what I was supposed to do, so where are you at? Why aren't you holding up your end of the bargain? I've sacrificed, I've given, so why am I not getting? Another thing that I like about Habakkuk is his resolve. Chapter 2 begins by him saying, I'm going to plant my flag right here, and I'm going to wait for an answer. He says it like this: I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch and see what God will say to me, and what God will answer me concerning my complaint. Maybe you've been there too. I'm not leaving till I have an answer. God gives him one. Chapter 2, verse 2. Then the Lord answered me and said, write this vision. Make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. In essence, what God is giving Habakkuk, what God is giving Israel, and what I believe God is giving to us is this invitation and perhaps even this request for us to live faithfully in the interim. Even in the face of things that don't seem right, God is asking us to live with faith in God's righteousness, even in the face of a lot of attributes, a lot of facts around us that seem to point to the contrary, that God wouldn't be righteous or faithful. You see, God has made a covenant with the people of Israel. There is a promise, there is a relationship that God will not leave or forsake Israel. And by the way, we think that same thing is true for us who are followers of Jesus. And so God has made this promise, and there's something more to it. Way back in Abraham, and Paul, by the way, will keep calling us throughout Romans back to Abraham. God has said, I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing unto the world. There is this promise, this covenant, that God will be faithful to these promises. And so all throughout the Old Testament, when prophets feel like they've been abandoned, or when people feel like God isn't living up to that, they begin to question God's righteousness. Is God righteous? Righteous meaning, will God stay faithful and true to that covenant and that promise? And sometimes as calamity comes around, it feels like God isn't. And so they'll call God to account on that. Like Habakkuk, they'll be very honest about it. They'll also use those same arguments when the people of Israel aren't upholding their end of the bargain. They'll say, God is righteous. We have an agreement. We have to do our part. We see this all throughout the Old Testament. I want to stick there for a little bit and share some ways that will perhaps help us understand, jump back to that original first line of our reading today, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Remember, I said Paul's going to keep hearkening back to his Old Testament scriptures, his Jewish scriptures, and his Jewish faith. We've already seen it once today as he quoted to Habakkuk. But I want to add that third wrinkle to what Paul might mean when he says that I am not ashamed. So I want to read just a few selected verses from Psalm 71, which is titled in my Bible, A Prayer for Lifelong Protection and Help. In you, O Lord, I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me and rescue me. Incline your ear to me to save me. Be for me a rock and a refuge, a strong fortress to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. Rescue me, O God, from the hand of the wicked, from the grasp of the cruel and unjust. For you, O God, are my hope, my trust from my youth. My mouth will tell of your righteous acts, of your deeds of salvation all day long. Though their number is past my knowledge, I will come praising the mighty deeds of the Lord God. I will praise your righteousness, yours alone. And your righteousness, O God, it reaches to the heavens. You who have done great things, O God, who is like you? All day long, my tongue will talk of your righteous help. For those who tried to do me harm have been put to shame. They have been disgraced. So I'm not sure if that connection is immediately clear, but it adds a deeper understanding to what Habakkuk is understanding. Not only is there this idea that God maybe is not being faithful to God's end of the bargain. And not only is that frustrating because of the loss and difficulty that sort of brings that situation about, but in the Israelite mindset, when failure and calamity and desolation fell upon them, it was not just a personal failure. It was not just about God's unfaithfulness. It was sort of those things very often, but it was also something that was cause for shame. Right in that opening verse, in your righteousness deliver me, let me never be put to shame. That's from Psalm 71. Put yourself in the Israelite mindset. There are other people who have other understandings of what is divine or what is God. And so if those other people are conquering you, not only do you have the desolation and the calamity, but it means that in which you have invested, that in which you have pledged your allegiance to, that in which you have dedicated yourself to, God, in this case the God of Israel, has left you to be shamed. Because it's been a bad investment. Because if their deity is meeting your deity, well, that's embarrassing. And so for them, this sort of failure and struggle and difficulty is not just about what's going on, and it's not just about whether God is holding up God's end of the bargain, but it's also shameful. When it seemed like God didn't show up, God didn't provide salvation, which specifically means that the protection from that which would persecute and oppress, it brought about shame. Psalm 44 says it this way: "You have made us the taunt of our neighbors." God has done this. God has put them to shame. "The derision and the scorn of those around us. You've made us a byword of the nations, a laughingstock among all the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and shame has covered my face." If God didn't show up, it was cause for shame, and it brought into question God's righteousness. But when God does show up, then we can join, the audience can join with Paul in saying with full confidence, "I am not ashamed." Paul says that, and Paul says that because Paul is convinced that God has shown up in a miraculous and incredible and massive way, a game-changing way, in a way that God has never shown up before in the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Remember, God made that promise to Abraham that Abraham would be blessed and would be a blessing to the nation. So the question all along the way is God righteous? Is God being faithful to that commitment? And Paul gives a resounding answer, yes, in the gospel, in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. God has fulfilled that in a huge way. It's a giant leap forward. So no, we haven't been shamed. God has indeed done what God has promised. So there's no need for shame. That's the good news. And even if it came about in a way that may seem improbable, and even if it's done by something that is as wretched as the cross, and even if it seems improper, that the gates have been flung wide open and that grace is now for all people, Paul is certain that God has been faithful and God has been righteous, and there is no reason to be ashamed. That's the good news of the gospel. Maybe that time when you were on the brink, when you came back from the edge, there was a huge sigh of relief. Maybe you feel that in the scripture. Let's move forward then and start back at the beginning of our Romans reading. Paul isn't ashamed for it is of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who has faith. For the Jew first and the Greek. Remember what we said just a minute ago about salvation. It's deliverance from that which would persecute or oppress. It's a very specific meaning that comes before Paul is writing, before the definition of that has been worked out in Christian history. And we're going to unpack that and revisit that over and over and over again. This idea that it's deliverance from that which would persecute or oppress. But he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation for all who have faith. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faithfulness for faithfulness." So the central idea is about this righteousness of God. And it's the title of the sermon, and God's own righteousness back there, because it's a really big point. We will revisit this over and over. And if there was one single phrase, one single idea that was the theme of this entire book, it would be the righteousness of God. But here's the deal. The way that it is sometimes translated in our scriptures in different versions, and the way that we've grown accustomed to hearing that, sometimes we miss the point that Paul is making. This is not about God's righteousness, which is imparted upon us or exchanged, given to us in exchange for something else, or imputed upon us. This is God's own righteousness. It's about God and who God is. God is faithful and righteous in God's self, regardless of who we are or how we respond. That's what he's talking about. This is about God's own faithfulness. And almost every time, I think there's like one exception, maybe two, in all of Romans, where we'll encounter this phrase, the righteousness of God, and it will be talking perhaps about how that is, how we are invited into that. 99% of the time, we're going to see that this is speaking about God's own righteousness. Paul is talking about the righteousness that delivers God's people from persecution and oppression, of all that would enslave and ensnare. So when the Old Testament writers call out to God and ask, what are you doing? And they cry out and ask, why won't you save me? At times they'll ask God to take account for God's actions or lack thereof in a sort of trial setting in an ancient Jewish tradition called law court. When they're doing that, they're appealing to God's righteousness. And sometimes they put God in the judge's seat of that law court, and the judge is required to be righteous. And so they'll say, have you judged us unrighteously? They'll ask that question. It's all based on the idea that God is in relationship, in covenant, has created a promise, and that God is going to bless them, and that through them bless the world. But when life gets hard and it doesn't feel like God is holding up God's end of the bargain, we're left to question. And God's answer to Habakkuk and to us is, can we trust and the faithfulness of who God is in God's righteousness to sustain us in those times that feel dark and difficult? So again, I ask, when have you been there? When we're there, we join in the voice of Habakkuk and recognize the same answer, the promise that God is faithful to God's righteousness, and that those who are faithful will live in that promise. That's what Paul draws us to at the very end of this thesis statement. And that's why Paul is not ashamed. He's in possession of the good news of God, the gospel. And for him, the gospel has power. It has power to deliver us from that which will oppress powers and sin of this world. It has the power to change lives. It has the power to move us closer to God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And the gospel is the ultimate fulfillment of God's righteousness. And in Paul's estimation, the fulfillment of the vision that God gives to Habakkuk. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It surely will come. It will not delay. So friends, the good news for you and me is that times when we find ourselves at our wits' end, God's vision has not gone away. When we clench our fists and yell at the sky, God doesn't shriek from our concerns. When we feel like we're journeying alone, the consistent witness of this book is that we are not, that we never have been, and we never will. Our roadmap through Romans will continue to point to these fundamental truths, that the gospel has power, like actual transformative power, that the gospel is delivering us from something that is real, and that the gospel is the culmination of God's own righteousness, the next step in the saga of God's plan for the redemption of the world, and that because of God's faithfulness, this is the fourth thing, we can be faithful to God's call in our own lives and trust that God is continuing to do the work of setting things right that are all disjointed. It feels to me like there's a lot of things that are disjointed right now. It feels to me like there's a lot of us who feel like we're in this place where we've come to the end of ourselves. And I'm not just talking about the Super Bowl. Ugh. But I'm thinking about a nation that continues to be entrenched at an impasse. And I'm thinking about the resiliency of privilege that continues to oppress. And I'm definitely thinking about the pandemic that seems to go on and on and on. As we approach Ash Wednesday, my spouse reminded me this week that Ash Wednesday was like the last special service that we were able to do together last year. And I think about Grace Extravaganza and how we got that in just while it was still safe, before there were stay-at-home orders and everything. And we said things at the beginning of the pandemic like, thank goodness we didn't have to do that virtual. How could we do that? Here we are. I'm thinking about the people whose jobs haven't come back yet, whose jobs haven't become safer, whose loved ones are still isolated in nursing homes. And I'm thinking about all the people who are fighting for their lives right now, and the doctors and the nurses and the therapists who are absolutely exhausted and fighting beside them. My hope is, friends, that with Paul, we can look back on where we've seen God be faithful in our lives, on the places that we've encountered God's good news of healing, of new possibility, of hope, of strength, of relationship, and that we can trust that God is still in the business of moving us towards all that is disjointed being made right. It just may take a while. But the journey, friends, Paul will attest to this over and over and over and over again. The journey is worth taking. So may we take it as well. Amen. Would you take a few moments for reflection?